Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, welcome to the Lion's Roar podcast, brought to you by Lion's Roar, a nonprofit media organization offering Buddhist wisdom and guidance for mindful living to benefit our lives and create a more caring and just world. For more, go to lionsroar.com, and if you enjoy this episode, subscribe so you don't miss future ones. Today we're resharing one of the most popular episodes of the Lion's Roar podcast, featuring essayist and novelist Pico Iyer. For Iyer, travel is a spiritual experience that shakes up our usual certainties and connects us to a richer, vaster world. In this conversation, Iyer and Lion's Roar editor-in-chief Melvin Mcleod discuss Iyer's book, The Half-Known Life in Search of Paradise, and his eclectic contemplative practice.
Hi, this is Melvin Mcleod. I'm the editor-in-chief of Lion's Roar, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome to this conversation Pico Iyer. Pico, as I'm sure many of our readers know, you'll pardon me if I embarrass you now, Pico, with praise, is, I think, be fair to say, one of the leading nonfiction writers of our time. A marvelous, fluid, and elegant writer and thinker. Certainly, I think, the premier travel writer of our day, and somebody who brings a contemplative view and practice to everything that he writes, and therefore is very much the kind of writer and person whom we love to be able to feature in Lion's Roar. So, Pico, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Melvin. And the one thing you left out is I've been writing for you for 26 years in Shambhala Sun and Lion's Roar regularly. So it's been such a wonderful home for me. So thank you for that.
Well, I should have added, in fact, friend and frequent contributor to Lion's Roar, and a real friend to me and to our publication. So let's start with a number of different topics I'd like to range over. But let's start with a very broad topic. As I say, I think you are really, of course, one of the premier and best-known travel writers of our time. And I think the premier writer who talks about travel as a spiritual experience, as broadening and deepening, as it were, as a broadening and deepening experience. So, and defining spiritual, it really in a broad sense and in a sort of non-necessarily religious sense. So, just in general, Pico, what do you think travel gives to us spiritually? And for those of us who do travel, pretty much everybody who's listening now, how do we approach travel in order to benefit from it spiritually?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think I've always seen travel as a means of transformation. And I think part of the beauty is not just leaving your home, but leaving your habits and the self that you recognize at home far behind. So I think, as you said, everybody listening to this conversation knows that when you're in a foreign place, and it could even be on the other side of town, you can't define yourself in the ways that you used to, and therefore there's a chance to become a slightly different self. And I'm always seeking out those places that will overturn my assumptions, push me beyond the level of what I think I know, and therefore potentially send me back a slightly different person from the one who left home. And of course, one doesn't have physically to undertake a travel to be liberated from oneself, but it's certainly a shortcut to doing it. Because if you or I are in the streets of Varanasi tomorrow, we can't begin to orient ourselves in familiar ways. And that already, I think, is a useful position. And we're freed, as I say, of the illusion of knowledge and of control. And I think the ways in which travel humbles us are also the ways in which travel releases us.
And indeed, softening or loosening our fixations and fixed views and fixed identity is indeed a spiritual benefit in itself. But if we were to look at sort of, that's almost the absence of a negative benefit, which is fine. But what would you say are the positive benefits when you talked about travel as a way of transforming ourselves? When we come home from such a transformative trip, in what specific and positive ways might we find ourselves transformed?
as I think of it, it's really like when the Buddha left his gilded palace to confront head on, I think, sickness, old age, and death. So for me, travel is a confrontation with reality, because when I'm at home, I'm living in my head to some extent, and I'm living according to plan, and uh, I can easily be in a kind of bubble, living within my preconceptions. Put me down in Jerusalem tomorrow. Reality is coming in at me from all directions, and I'm having to navigate it. I think travel, cuts through projections and illusions very quickly, and that may be an absence of a negative too. But I left my comfortable job in New York City when I was 29, and I wasn't unaware of the fact that, my first name is Siddhartha. My parents named me after the Buddha, and I wasn't unaware that that's what the Buddha felt that his obligation was, because I was living in something of a gilded palace, and I thought, I want to meet the world head on. And I think in some ways that was a long time ago that I did that, 35 years ago. But now it's so easy to get the world at second hand and through small screens and in two dimensions, therefore. And I think there's in fact a greater need than ever to encounter the world in all its kind of confounding intensity. So that's one thing I get. It strips me, takes me out of my head and into something I can't begin to get my head around. And it strips me of the comfortable notions that I hide behind, I think.
One of the things that we do when we travel, of course, is we come from one culture, probably our native culture, encounter another culture. And that encounter between two cultures can be very valuable. And most of us only do that when we travel, but I think it's fair to say that you yourself are almost by definition have long lived in the space of the encounter of cultures. Your family is of Indian background. Your parents lived in the United States. You spent a long time in the United States. Right now, I'm speaking to you when you're in Japan. At the same time, as if I am correct, you spend about half a year in Japan and about half a year in California. So I would say you're existing in that space in which you are not solely trapped within a single culture, but are constantly encountering other cultures and coming up against each other. For you, goes beyond travel to the very place where your life is, a transcultural existence.
Yes, and then the other big component that is also part of that is I was born and spent my first 21 years in England. So my parents moved from England to California when I was 7, but that meant that from the time I was 7, is this funny creature with an Indian face and an English voice and an American green card. So you're absolutely right. I've always lived in the passageways and the intersections between cultures, and I've always thought that was a great blessing, because I felt as a little boy that I was growing up with 3 sets of eyes, 3 ways of looking at the world. And as you suggested, I could mix and match them and play them off against one another. I could see California with Indian eyes and then see India with English eyes, or with many kinds of eyes. And I think the big change in the world in the course of my lifetime is that it seemed very unusual when I was growing up. I was the only dark-skinned kid in all my classes in England. And now, if we go to any classroom in certainly in Canada or England or United States, I think most of the kids are more international than I and live even more powerfully in the convergence of myriad cultures. And I'm glad if that helps us explode the black and white distinctions of the past, which I think it does, and forces us to define ourselves in some more rigorous and inward way, and think about our home as really what lives inside us rather than just the place where we happen to be living. But you're right, that travel was always second nature to me, and has therefore never been of huge interest to me. From the time I was 9, I was going back and forth 6 times a year over the North Pole by myself, flying between my parents' home in California and my schools in England. So the airport really became a place where both I felt at home and where I thought, this is where I have to make some concrete identity.
Just as an aside, I'll tell our audience that, Pico, you and I share the common experience of suffering the tender mercies of a British-style public school, but we won't go there.
We've gone there enough in life.
But what do you think? Just in the last question, in terms of the general travel area, to me, politically, there's so many ramifications, both of traveling, but perhaps even more importantly, of people not traveling. If that much of the toxic populism we see in the world today, and its manifestation as xenophobia and racism, is founded on people not having any exposure to communities, to peoples, to cultures beyond their own immediate surroundings. It's very hard to have that kind of empathetic, broad view and sympathetic view of other peoples if you've never actually encountered them in person and never left your hometown or your home state. And so, I mean, to what extent do you um, uh, attribute some of the again, more xenophobic, racist elements that are happening, not simply in the United States, but in certainly across Europe? Never mind, let's not even discuss India these days, to people's lack of direct knowledge of communities and peoples beyond their own immediate environment.
Exactly. Fear, I think, is always based on ignorance. And when I say that I'm interested in the world beyond our screens, I mean not just beyond the little screens through which we take in the world, but beyond our projections. And that's the beauty of confronting something in the raw, because suddenly you're confronted with something much larger than your ideas of it. And the world is always richer than our ideas of it. One reason that I've always been admiring of Canada is that, enjoying some of the same circumstances as the United States, I feel there's a much greater engagement with the world, eagerness to learn about the world, eagerness to speak two languages, and eagerness to welcome the world into your borders than south of the border. But I do feel that very much. And where you and I are living in the first generation almost, where those of us with the means do have the chance to confront the world firsthand. And so it seems a great shame to hide behind our notions. And I know exactly whence that comes, because I find when I'm sitting at home, I think I know it all. And I called my new book The Half-Known Life as a way of reminding myself that it's only when we're at home and in our heads we have the assumption, I know more or I know better than you. And as soon as we're actually in the streets, we see that we're united by everything that we don't know. Whenever I'm sitting at home, I think about Syria or Iran or North Korea. I think of everything about them that's different from my world in terms of politics and culture and economy, perhaps. And as soon as I'm on the ground in one of those places, get off the plane in Damascus or Havana or Pyongyang, again, I'm confronted with a human reality where I have a lot in common. So it's only by keeping the world at a distance that we can preserve that illusion of difference. And it's as soon as we meet the world in the flesh, we're reminded of the things that we share. So it's a hard, vicious cycle to cut through, but I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, again, one doesn't have to travel far to encounter the world now. Go to Toronto or Vancouver or New York or San Francisco, and all the cultures of the world are pretty much on your doorstep. And so I think part of the division we see now is between the city and the countryside, because the cities are largely part of this multicultural global 21st century reality. The countryside is often more in the old black and white definitions of the 19th century. And so New York City probably has much more in common with Tokyo than it does with rural New York State.
So let's turn to your new book, and it's called The Half-Known Life in Search of Paradise. So the obvious first question is, did you find it? But we're going to leave that for a sec, although I think in the end we'll get there. But I would like to break down these two different terms in this title. Now, you've given us one definition of the half-known life, the life that we know only when we're in our immediate, familiar, comfortable surroundings, that both create and reflect who we already are. But it strikes me that may have a deep other meanings as well, and I think you talk about that in your book. So I think my question is this a permanent condition? Is this living a half-known life a permanent condition or not? Is it possible for us to be in a situation of not knowing life fully, but through things like travel, education, contemplation, to know life more fully, at least, or actually fully? Or is the half known life really inherent in the human condition, and that the longing to fully know life is something that will ultimately never be satisfied or accomplished?
I love that question. And my prejudice is that it is a permanent condition, and it's a condition to embrace, that life doesn't offer answers, and that our lives are defined by how readily we embrace the state of answerlessness. And our lives are defined by what we do with the myriad things we can't understand. I know that, for example, John Tarrant, who writes beautifully in your pages, often talks about not knowing as a form of intimacy, which I think is a basic principle, especially in Zen study, and don't know mind. And that makes all the sense in the world to me, because I've found that everything essential that determines my life, falling in love, seeing my house burn down within 3 hours, suddenly having the world stopped by a pandemic, stepping out onto the terrace of the Patala Palace in Lhasa, feeling myself lifted to a state that I didn't know was inside myself. All of those I can't begin to explain, and would only be reduced if I tried to put words or ideas to that. And so I do feel that our permanent condition is living in a little tent in the Himalayas late at night. So we may have lanterns there, and we'll probably have a flashlight, but we're surrounded by the vast darkness of the nighttime, pinpricked by stars, or the outline of the silver mountains, but things far greater and larger than we are. And how ready we are to accept them really will define how happy our lives are. The half-known life, as you know from reading the book, comes from Melville. And I think the poignancy of Melville's life was he was always trying to come to answers. What's the meaning of life? Does God exist? What's the relation of God to evil? And I think there's no answer to those. And he, by seeking answers, ended up almost exiled, walking sleepless through the streets of New York City, forgotten and unable to come to rest. And so I sort of feel that we need to come to rest in the awareness of everything that we can't hope to understand.
So the subtitle of the book is In Search of Paradise. And I think in the book you pose the dilemma, which is the fundamental human dilemma, of how we would find paradise or Shangri-La or some perfect level of existence in the midst of all of the terrible conflict and pain and suffering in this world. And in fact, your book, as many of your books are, is a travelogue of taking us through chapter by chapter of various places that you visit and study. And many of them are places that are very extreme examples of that, in which there are traditions of spiritual sanctuary or perfection within that, and yet at the same time are among the most conflict-riven, tragic places in our world today. When I would just mention Iran, Jerusalem, Northern Ireland, among the places you visited. So, so when you visit these places where the contrast is so extreme between, we could almost argue, some of the founding mythologies of those places or hopes of those places and the current reality. So how when you were immersed in those places, how did that disconnect strike you?
So for me, the disconnect is, again, between the reality and the thoughts of reality that I have, which will always be much smaller. And you mentioned Jerusalem, which is the perfect example, because there is the home of three great monotheisms, each so beautiful in its own right, and yet the city of faith has been the city of conflict for more than 2,000 years. And yet, when I go there, and I'm not a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew, there's something in the air, and there's something in those little stones that moves me almost to tears. And every morning I walk through the pre-dawn dark when I'm there to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and I sit in this little ragged space where there's nothing but a rocky ledge and a guttering candle. And I do feel transformed. In fact, Elaine Pagels, the great scholar of religions, said, "Oh, this book's just a Buddhist parable." And she's probably right. Because you said so perfectly, in the search for paradise, I go to places of great conflict and difficulty. And the book was written during the pandemic when all of us were living very, very close to death with extinction breathing down our necks. And my sense was that the only paradise I could trust is one I would find right in the middle of the real world and in the face of death. And here in Japan, they often talk about life as joyful participation in a world of sorrows. That sorrows are, far better than I, are non-negotiable. They're a part of everybody's life. But the fact of sorrows doesn't have to preclude joy. And the fact of conflict in Jerusalem doesn't have to preclude real moments of beauty and surrender and wonder there. So I suppose the book was my way of saying that we can't hope to live in a world without suffering or difficulty or challenge, but none of those things mean the absence of hope, possibility, and the chance for kindness.
So you've written often for Lions Roar and elsewhere about your own spiritual practice, about loving to go to a, I believe, Christian contemplative monastery near Big Sur, and in those pieces, let's put it this way: you had said in this conversation, you're not a Christian, you're not a Muslim, whatever else you said. You don't actually ever say what you are, which is fine. Maybe you are nothing. Maybe that's the very point of this question, because it seems to me that when you write about your own practice, it falls into the broader non-sectarian contemplative category, where indeed one finds a great deal of commonality among contemplative traditions within the different religions. In fact, in many ways, more commonality among the contemplative traditions within different religions than they themselves share with the more exoteric members of their own religion. So, when you talk about the space and peace and beauty of, being in the monastery and looking out over the California coast out to the sea and the sky and the clouds and the weather, that strikes me as just a very universal contemplative experience, not necessarily tied to any specific religious tradition or practice. But that may not be right. So when you go there, and what would you describe your own spiritual / contemplative practice to be?
In some ways, my greatest teacher, I think, is silence, which seems to dissolve me and open me up into something much wider, just the way you described. And I think everybody who's been on a retreat, whether it's a Vipassana retreat or a Zen sesshin or at a Catholic monastery, as you said, is partaking of the same silence and clarity in certain ways. And again, the nice thing about my Christian friends who belong to the Camaldolese order, which is the most contemplative order within Catholicism, is that they don't make distinctions. They learn they're 14 miles away from the Tassajara Zen Center, and they interact constantly with the Tassajara monks and actually go and learn from them and share workshops with them. So I actually every summer, traditionally, I've been leading a workshop at Tassajara in the Zen tradition with a Zen abbess, and then 14 miles away, going to speak to going to spend lots of time with my Catholic friends. And from my point of view, you mentioned boarding schools earlier, and I was born and grew up in Anglican England. We had to go to chapel twice a day. We had to sing the Lord's Prayer in Latin on Sundays. So by the time I was 21, I had had enough crosses and hymns to last me a lifetime. And it was the one tradition that I wasn't open to, the way I might be open to the Zen tradition or Sufism or others. And so in that way, it was a perfect blessing to end up spending so much of my life with these Christian monks and the very grounded and decent people who have formed around them. So it's given me the chance to learn from Merton and Richard Rohr and Thomas Keating and some of the great Christian contemplatives. I think whoever I was, I would have spent a lot of time learning from Leonard Cohen and the Dalai Lama and Shunryu Suzuki and many from that tradition. But I'm glad that as this strange global creature who belongs to many cultures, I've also been able to learn from the Christians, whom otherwise I think I would have written off. And I guess in terms of the context of my life, as you said at the very outset, growing up between these many cultures, it's been a challenge that I haven't been rooted in a single one, but it's been a blessing that I've been able to learn from all of them. And I think maybe the best way of answering your question is I try always to spend autumn here in Japan, which is for me a very deeply Buddhist country. My wife is Buddhist, and I met her in a Zen temple in Kyoto. And I think the Buddhist tradition to me has looked more unblinkingly at suffering and impermanence and loss than any of the traditions I'm acquainted with. And if you're thinking about death and how to live in the midst of death, as you said before, how to love in the face of loss, I think the Buddhist tradition really has something to offer everyone, whether or not you have a Buddhist practice. When it comes to springtime light and affirmation and notion of resurrection inside the spirit, the Christian tradition is very strong. And so I tend to spend my springs often in the Benedictine Hermitage, because just the flooding of light and the flowering and the celebration that goes with that is something that takes very full-bodied form there. So I'm very grateful that Buddhism can teach me about the end of life, and Christianity can teach me about the light within the end.
And it sounds like, in a way, and I'm very jealous, that you were capable of enjoying and drawing from the best of different religions, which I would say would basically fall into this broadly contemplative category. So my final question is about, in effect, the nature of religion itself and its influence in the world, because I think that, to be fair, one of the greatest challenges is facing the world is what I would call toxic religion. In so many ways, toxic, and conflation with nationalism, with xenophobia, with racism. And it's interesting when I go back to your book, In the Search of Paradise, and some of the places that you went, which we named, which was like Jerusalem and Northern Ireland and Iran. It's not simply that those places have a deep spirituality and also almost incidentally are places of conflict and suffering. Religion is itself the very cause of that suffering. So you have this sort of the positive and negatives of religion right there in one place.
Yes.
And so, my own feeling is that the kind of contemplative, open, non-fixated, non-certain religion, like of the contemplatives practice, that emphasizes universal human values, is the antidote and alternative to the various forms of toxic religions. But people seem to gravitate a lot more to my God is better than your God, rather than, as you suggest, the power of silence. So is there any real possibility that the kind of practice you do could become more widespread and have the kind of beneficial result that I think the world needs? Or is that always going to remain kind of a minority thing? And if so, if it were possible to have the contemplative view of contemplative religion to become more widely practiced, how would we get there? How would we tell people about it?
I think it's that trend is developing very, very quickly, and your magazine is the perfect example of this. 40 years ago, if Lions Roar existed, it might not have been so easy to find people who speak for that practice. And now I'm sure there are more than you have space for in your magazines. So you're absolutely right. I think when I called my book The Half-Known Life, it was a way of saying we don't need certainty and we don't need conclusions, but we probably do need counsel and wisdom to navigate a world that's always going to have shadow as well as light. And so I think actually the medical example is a good one, because none of us is going to be cured of life. All of us are mortal. No doctor is infallible. All a doctor can offer is a prescription, that the best she can offer for the condition that she is diagnosed. And I think we all need that kind of expertise, which is why we turn to the contemplative masters through the ages, and why we go on retreat, why we look for teachers right now, because we need counsel and we need wisdom, but we certainly don't need fixed and final truths. And I think as the world is ever more exposed to traditions other than its birth tradition, that's exactly what we're seeing developing. And I genuinely feel that Lions Roar has been chronicling this, not just growth, but maybe explosion of this. And we do hear a lot of people saying they want to be, they consider themselves spiritual but not religious. I could imagine people also saying they're religious but not spiritual. In other words, they're looking for community and some of the things that religion offers, even though they don't necessarily feel they have to develop an individual spiritual practice. But in either case, I do think we're all aware of many more options than when I was growing up. And there are many more teachers in our midst from every corner of the globe. And so I think the world is moving very quickly in that way, just in the same way that it's moving beyond fixed identities of every kind. As I say, in a typical classroom today, most of the children have many places and traditions within them. And I think that's the signature quality of the 21st century. And as you said earlier, nationalism is on the rise, but I think that's because it's on the run, because it senses incrementally, individual by individual, the world is losing its old strict definitions and borders and black and white distinctions, and turning into a multicolored series of multicolored individuals. So populism is having maybe one hopes its last roar. Certainly it's shouting very loudly at the moment, but largely because the world is accelerating in a very different direction. So I do see the contemplative tradition that doesn't need to define itself as belonging to East and West or this school or that school as being a balm to more and more people.
And to conclude, I would simply say that I do think that you really write about, exemplify, and clearly practice that form of contemplative religion that does transcend a single tradition or a single identity. And I think I would urge all of you listening to this now, obviously Pico's books are well known and brilliant, but I would also urge you to look at our website, lionsroar.com, because you may find there pieces by Pico that also reflect a little more writing about this spiritual contemplative side, which would fit more in a niche publication like ours than some of his more broadly popular books. Although using a book like The Half Known Life to talk about the holiness is clearly an attempt to do that. But nonetheless, I would urge. I think there's some really great pieces that you've written at that monastery for us and about your contemplative experience. So I'd urge all of our listeners now to look at some more and get a range of a look at the full range of the things, both spiritual and in so many different respects that you've written, that you write about, and indeed that you've written about for us. So I'm going to conclude. I really want to thank you, Pico. Our relationship over the years has meant a great deal to me. Our occasional meetings and certainly working with you has always been a great delight. And to work with a writer of your caliber is a great honor for me. Not only a writer in the broadest sense, not only of a brilliant stylist, but a brilliant thinker. That's because a great writer has to be both. And so I want to give you my thanks for our relationship and your contributions to Lions Roar and to your contributions to the world.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Melvin. It really means a lot to me. And honestly, I'm so grateful to you for giving me a home. I mean, as you were talking a minute ago, I think maybe I've written 40 articles for Lions Roar over the 26 years. And just as you say, many of them I would never have been able to place anywhere else. Thank you for being such a perfect friend and colleague for more than a quarter of a century now.
My great pleasure. So thank you very much to Pico, to all of you who are listening to this now. I'm Melvin Mcleod, Editor-in-Chief of Lions Roar.
Thanks for listening. Mission-driven, nonprofit, and community-supported, Lion's Roar offers Buddhist teachings, news, and perspectives so that the understanding and practice of mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom flourish in today's world. Go to lionsroar.com and subscribe to receive unlimited access to online articles, meditation instructions, our new Buddhist glossary, and so much more.